If the world were like a Sleep Number mattress, everything would adapt for your comfort. Your coffee would never get cold. Your flight would always be on time. And your mattress would always respond to you and your unique sleep needs. Sleep Number mattresses are designed to respond to your body and shift with your changing life, helping you fall asleep faster and stay asleep longer. To experience a whole new world of comfort, visit a Sleep Number store or go to sleepnumber.com. Sleep Number. To a good life sleep.
A small brick house sits on North 2nd Street in Atchison, Kansas. At first glance, there's nothing particularly unusual about it. It's surrounded by other homes. Cars drive past every day. Neighbors mow their lawns. Children ride their bikes down the street. But for more than 30 years, people have claimed something inside that house doesn't want to be left alone. Visitors have reported hearing a little girl laugh when no one else was there. Lights have turned on by themselves. Objects have moved. Pictures have been found hanging upside down. Electronic devices have behaved strangely. Some investigators claim to have captured mysterious voices. And then there are the scratches. Deep scratches, 3 at a time. The most famous reports came from a young couple who moved into the house in the early 1990s. They claimed the activity grew so intense that it left physical marks on the husband and transformed an ordinary rental house into one of the most talked about haunted homes in America. Many believe the spirit behind the haunting is a little girl named Sallie. According to the legend, she was rushed to the house suffering from severe abdominal pain. A doctor began an emergency operation, believing her appendix had burst. But before the surgery was finished, the little girl died on the operating table. Some believe she never realized she was gone. Others believe she blamed the doctor for her death. And if the stories are true, she's been there ever since. But how much of that story is actually true? Was there really a little girl named Sallie? Did she die in that house? Or has one of America's most famous haunted houses been built on a legend that changed over time? Tonight, we're stepping inside the Sallie House, not just to explore the haunting, but to investigate the history behind it. Hello and welcome to Haunted Thursday, a special series from the Halloween podcast. I am your host, Lyle Perez. Every week we visit a different haunted location and explore the stories that have made it famous. Sometimes those stories have been passed down for generations. Sometimes they're supported by eyewitness accounts, newspaper reports, or local legends. And sometimes when you start digging into the history, you find that the truth is a little more complicated than the ghost story itself. Today's stop takes us to Atchison, Kansas, a town that's earned the nickname the most haunted town in Kansas. It's home to dozens of ghost stories, historic buildings, and reported hauntings, but one house stands above the rest. A modest brick home at 508 North 2nd Street has become one of the most investigated haunted houses in America. It's been featured on television, visited by paranormal investigators from around the world, and has gained a reputation for strange voices, moving objects, unexplained scratches, and the spirit of a little girl, known simply as Sallie. If you've spent any time watching paranormal television over the last 30 years, chances are you've heard of the Sallie House. It's become one of those places that's almost legendary in ghost hunting circles. Ask 10 paranormal investigators to name America's most haunted houses, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Sallie House showed up on most of their lists. The story most people know is both tragic and terrifying. A young girl is rushed to a doctor's home with severe stomach pain. Believing it's a life or death emergency, the doctor begins operating before the anesthesia has fully taken effect. The little girl dies during the procedure, and according to the legend, her frightened and confused spirit never leaves the house. Over the years, she's said to have frightened visitors, played with children, spoken through electronic devices, and in some cases, physically attacked the people living there. It's a story that's been told in books, documentaries, television specials, podcasts, and countless videos online. But as I started researching this episode, I found myself asking a simple question. Did any of it actually happen? Was there really a little girl named Sallie? Did she die inside that house? Who was the doctor? And if this story has been passed around for decades, what does the historical record actually say? So, for this episode, we're going to do something a little different. We'll tell the legend exactly as it's been handed down over the years. Then we're going to step away from the ghost stories and dig into old newspapers, property records, and the history of the people who actually lived in the house. Because sometimes the history supports the legend, and sometimes it raises even more questions. Our story begins with the legend of a little girl named Sallie. Like many famous ghost stories, there isn't just one version of the Sallie House legend. Over the years, details have changed depending on who's telling it, but the heart of the story has remained much the same. According to the legend, a young girl named Sallie became violently ill with severe pain in her abdomen. Her parents rushed her to the nearest doctor, whose home also served as his medical office. Fearing her appendix had burst, the doctor believed there wasn't time to waste. He began an emergency operation before the anesthesia had fully taken effect. The story says Sallie was still conscious as the surgery began, terrified and unable to understand what was happening. She died before the operation was over. That's the version of the story that has been repeated for years. Some say Sallie never realized she had died. Others believe she blamed the doctor for what happened and remained in the house out of fear, anger, or confusion. However it began, the legend says her spirit never left. For decades, the house sat quietly as just another home in Atchison. If strange things happened there, very little was written about them. It wasn't until the early 1990s that the Sallie House would become known across the country. In 1993, Tony and Deborah Pickman rented the house, expecting nothing more than an ordinary place to live. They later said they had no idea the home carried a ghost story. At first, the experiences seemed small. Lights behaved strangely. Objects appeared to move. There were odd noises that couldn't be explained. But before long, the activity became much more personal. Tony claimed he began waking up with scratches on his body. Not small scratches either. Some were long, deep, and appeared without any obvious explanation. He also reported feeling as though he was being pushed or struck by something he couldn't see. Deborah described hearing voices and seeing objects move on their own. The couple said the activity grew more frequent and more intense the longer they lived in the house. Their story eventually caught the attention of the television program Sightings, which featured the Sallie House in the mid-1990s.
On this edition of Sightings, a frightening entity leaves a bloody trail.
Sallie, stop it!
On tape, it's a stunning paranormal event.
She scares the living daylights out of me.
Welcome to Sightings. I'm Tim White. A ghostly presence on videotape. It's the one piece of hard evidence that's eluded our ghost investigations. Until now. When Sightings received a call from a beleaguered family in the Midwest, our team went to investigate. What they found was haunting activity unlike anything this Sightings crew had ever seen. The result was hours of bizarre, ghostly activity captured for the first time on videotape.
The first signs of something out of the ordinary began when the young couple moved into this 128-year-old house in January of 1993. At first, the haunting activity was subtle and only seemed to be occurring in one small bedroom at the top of the stairs. Pamela and Jeff had a weird, indefinable feeling that something wasn't quite right. Their usually docile dog started feeling it too. She would whimper and cry any time she came near that room. They now feel the persistent barking was a warning they did not heed.
Overnight, the small brick house in Atchison became known to paranormal investigators across the country. More television shows followed. Psychics visited. Ghost hunters arrived with cameras, recorders, and equipment designed to capture evidence of the supernatural. Some claimed to record unexplained voices. Others reported seeing shadow figures, hearing footsteps, or experiencing the same uneasy feeling described by the Pickmans. Today, the Sallie House is considered one of America's most famous haunted homes. Thousands of people know the legend of the little girl, the doctor, and the terrifying experiences reported inside its walls. But as I started looking into the story, I kept coming back to one question. If this really happened, where's the history? One of the first things I wanted to know was whether the little girl at the center of the legend had ever been identified in the historical record. You'd think a story this well known would have an obituary, a newspaper article, or at least a death notice. After all, if a child had died during an emergency operation inside a doctor's home, that would have been a tragedy people remembered. So I started digging. I searched Atchison newspapers from the late 1800s and early 1900s looking for a little girl named Sallie, Sarah, or any similar name. I searched for reports of children dying from appendicitis, emergency surgeries, and anything involving the address at 508 North 2nd Street. I also started tracing the history of the house itself and the people who live there. That search led me to the Finney family. The house was built by Michael C. Finney, usually referred to as M.C. Finney in the newspapers. He came to Atchison in 1856 and was a businessman rather than a physician. His wife, Kate Finney, also appeared throughout the local newspapers over the years. In fact, I found classified advertisements from the 1890s and even as late as 1917 listing Kate Finney at 508 North 2nd Street, showing the family remained connected to the property for decades. The doctor associated with the house wasn't M.C. Finney at all. It was his son. Dr. Charles C. Finney was born in Atchison in 1865 and graduated from Beaumont Medical College in St. Louis in 1894 before returning home to practice medicine. Newspaper articles describe him as a respected physician who later became mayor of Atchison. He was well known throughout the community, and his career is well documented in local newspapers. That immediately caught my attention, because nearly every version of the Sallie legend says the doctor who treated the little girl lived in the house. At first, it seemed like everything was lining up. There really was a doctor. There really was a doctor's house. And there really were children in Atchison suffering from appendicitis around the turn of the 20th century. Newspaper after newspaper reported young patients becoming critically ill, doctors debating emergency operations, and families hoping their children would survive. The medical backdrop for the legend was completely believable, but the more newspapers I searched, the stranger the story became. I could find reports of appendicitis. I could find reports of operations. I could find the Finney family. I could even trace the ownership of the house. What I couldn't find was Sallie. After spending hours going through old newspapers, I never found a little girl named Sallie who died during an emergency appendectomy at the house. That doesn't mean it never happened, but it does mean there's no contemporary newspaper account that matches the story as it's commonly told today. What I did find was something unexpected. Appendicitis was a very real and very frightening illness in Atchison around the turn of the 20th century. Newspapers regularly reported children becoming critically ill. Some recovered after surgery, others were described as being in grave condition. In one article, a 10-year-old girl underwent an emergency operation after being sick for 2 weeks. In another, a 4-year-old boy was suffering from appendicitis while doctors debated whether surgery was necessary. Yet another article described a child in intense pain as physicians struggled to determine the best course of treatment. Reading those articles, it's easy to understand why appendicitis terrified families. Today, it's often treated with routine surgery, but at the end of the 19th century, it could quickly become fatal. Every case carried uncertainty, and newspapers frequently followed the progress of young patients because the outcome was anything but guaranteed. So, the medical setting behind the Sallie legend is historically accurate. Children did become seriously ill. Doctors did perform emergency operations. Families did lose loved ones. What I couldn't find was the one case that should have tied everything together. No article about a little girl named Sallie. No report of a child dying during surgery inside the Finney home. No obituary that matched the legend. The more I searched, the more I started wondering if the story had changed over time. Maybe the girl's name wasn't Sallie. Maybe the tragedy happened somewhere else and eventually became attached to the doctor's house. Or maybe several real events slowly blended together until they became the ghost story that's told today. Whatever the answer is, the historical trail becomes surprisingly difficult to follow. The house is real. The Finney family is real. Dr. Charles C. Finney was a real physician. But the little girl at the center of the legend remains just out of reach, like a name that's been repeated so many times that everyone assumes it's history, even though no one seems to know where it first came from. That doesn't mean the Sallie House isn't haunted. Those are really two separate questions. One question is whether people have experienced something unusual inside the house. The other is whether the story explaining that haunting is historically accurate. There's no shortage of people who believe they've encountered something at the Sallie House. Since the Pickmans' experiences became public in the early 1990s, paranormal investigators, psychics, television crews, and curious visitors have all spent time inside the home. Many have reported hearing unexplained voices, seeing shadowy figures, feeling cold spots, or witnessing objects move without anyone touching them. Some investigators claim to have captured electronic voice phenomena, while others have left convinced the house is home to something they couldn't explain. Of course, not everyone reaches that conclusion. Skeptics point out that once a place becomes known as haunted, every creak, every strange sound, and every unexplained event is viewed through that lens. A house more than 100 years old is going to make noises. Old wiring can cause electrical problems. Floors settle. Doors shift. Our minds naturally look for patterns, especially when we already know the stories connected to a place. Then there's another possibility. Maybe the haunting and the legend aren't dependent on one another. Even if the story of Sallie has changed over the years, or even if no little girl by that name ever died in the house, that doesn't automatically explain away the experiences people say they've had there. Likewise, even if every reported experience has a perfectly ordinary explanation, it doesn't tell us where the legend of Sallie first came from. In other words, we're left with two mysteries instead of one. There's the mystery of what people believe they've experienced inside the house. And there's the mystery of how a little girl named Sallie became forever connected to it. Sometimes those two stories overlap, sometimes they don't, but together they've transformed an ordinary brick house in Atchison, Kansas, into one of the most famous haunted homes in America. What I enjoyed most about researching this episode wasn't trying to prove or disprove the haunting. It was following the trail wherever it led. I started with a ghost story I'd heard for years. Like a lot of people, I'd always accepted the basic outline. A little girl named Sallie died during an emergency operation. Her spirit remained behind, and strange things began happening inside the house. But once I started looking through old newspapers and tracing the history of the property, I realized how much of that story rests on tradition instead of documentation. That doesn't make the legend any less interesting. In some ways, it makes it even more fascinating. Ghost stories have a way of growing over time. Details get added. Names become attached to events. Separate stories sometimes merge together until no one remembers where one ends and another begins. Before long, the legend becomes more familiar than the history itself. The Sallie House may be exactly that kind of story. The house is unquestionably real. The Finney family is real. Dr. Charles C. Finney was a real physician. We found newspaper accounts showing that children in Atchison really did suffer from appendicitis during that era. But somewhere between those documented facts and the modern legend, the trail grows cold. Maybe one day someone will uncover an old diary, a forgotten death record, or a newspaper article that's been overlooked for more than a century. Maybe we'll finally learn who Sallie was, or discover that she had another name entirely. Until then, the legend continues to live in the space between history and folklore. And maybe that's why people are still drawn to the Sallie House. Not because every question has an answer, but because so many of them still don't. Have you ever visited the Sallie House? Have you ever had an experience in a place that everyone claimed was haunted? Maybe you heard something you couldn't explain, saw something out of the corner of your eye, or simply had a feeling that you couldn't shake. Or maybe you've done your own research into a famous haunting and discovered that the history didn't quite match the legend. If you've had an experience like that, I'd love to hear it. Call the Halloween Podcast hotline and leave me a message. Tell me where it happened, what you experienced, and what you think was really going on. Your story may be featured in a future episode of Haunted Thursday. The number is 731-400-0472. And here's this week's question. Do you think a ghost story has to be historically accurate to be meaningful? Or can a legend become just as important as the truth? I'd love to hear what you think. That'll do it for this edition of Haunted Thursday. I hope you enjoyed our investigation into the Sallie House and the history behind one of America's most famous haunted homes. Whether you believe the house is haunted or think the legend has simply grown over time, one thing is certain. It's a story that continues to capture people's imagination more than a century after it supposedly began. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow the Halloween Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. You can also find us online at thehalloweenpodcast.com and on Facebook and Instagram by searching The Halloween Podcast. Thanks again for listening, and have a good night. Sources for this episode included historical issues of the Atchison Champion, the Atchison Daily Globe, the Atchison Daily Patriot, and the St. Joseph News Press. We also used property and family information connected to 508 North 2nd Street, accounts of the experiences reported by Tony and Deborah Pickman, and portions of a documentary about the Sallie House available on YouTube. As always, we compared the commonly told legend with the historical record to separate what can be documented from what remains part of the haunting's mystery.
Insurance isn't one size fits all. That's why drivers have enjoyed Progressive's Name Your Price tool for years now. With the Name Your Price tool, you tell them what you want to pay, and they'll show you options that fit your budget. So whether you're picking out your first policy or just looking for something that works better for you and your family, they make it easy to see your options. Visit Progressive.com. Find a rate that works for you with the Name Your Price tool. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law.
Summer is here, which means we all want to look and feel our best. A GLP-1 may be right for you. Visit orderlymeds.com to learn more about which GLP-1 you could be eligible for. Getting started is fast, easy, and happens virtually through telemedicine from licensed professionals. Check it out for yourself. Go to orderlymeds.com/podcast. That's orderlymeds.com/podcast. Taking care of yourself feels great. Compounded medications are not FDA approved. Eligibility required and determined by a licensed provider. Individual results may vary. See website for details.